The mid to late 20th century for Cuba had been marked with two distinct and ideologically opposed regimes. The right-wing authoritarian dictatorship of Fulgencio Batista, which ruled from 1952 to 1958, and the left-wing communist state of ruled by Fidel Castro, which started off in 1959 and extended into the 21st century. This video will create an evaluation of the living conditions of the Cuban people under these two leaders, examining economic realities, healthcare, and education that will prove that Castro's communist rule, despite its economic struggles and political restrictions, massively improved the healthcare and education for the majority of Cubans. Cuba's economy under Batista's reign was effective whilst experiencing corruption and inequality between urban and rural workers. According to Norton Ginsberg's Atlas of Economic Development, out of 122 countries, Cuba ranked 22nd in socio-economic development. Cuba's economy relied on mahogany, pineapple, high-grade tobacco, and sugar exports. But not all was well. The sugar industry that had been the backbone of Cuba's economy for a few decades had begun to dwindle, causing a rise of poverty, especially in the rural areas. The sugar industry was seasonal, causing the macheteros, sugarcane cutters, to be unemployed for 8 months every year. This and other factors led to 1 in 3 Cubans to live in poverty. While this was happening in rural areas, urban workers enjoyed working conditions similar to modern America, such as 8-hour workdays and overtime pay, which showed how Batista prioritized urban areas over rural areas. Batista's prioritization towards urban areas led to 43% lacking electricity, 85% of rural houses lacking piped water, and 54% lacking a toilet. But even with Batista focusing on urban areas, the government spent little on health, infrastructure, housing, and education, causing living conditions to stagnate for ordinary Cubans during the 1950s. Also, the economy was heavily controlled by the US in the late 50s with 90% of Cuban mines, 80% of its public utilities, 50% of its railways, 40% of its sugar production, and 25% of its bank deposits being in the US financial interest, which was some $1 billion in total. This caused lots of money earned to flow to foreign interests, which meant less money towards the Cuban economy and people. Cuba's economy under Castro's rule faced many economic issues. The main challenge was the 1963 US embargo on Cuba, which is still in place today and has massively affected Cuba's economy. The Cuban government themselves managed the economy poorly, with them making many economic mistakes. But not all was bad. They managed to get rid of the worst problems of poverty in the island, and employment was extended to nearly all citizens. As Fidel's movement had depended on the support of the farmers in rural Cuba, he worked to develop the Cuban countryside. This graph covers the GDP per capita in Cuba from 1960 to 1989, which shows that the GDP was stagnant during the 60s and early 70s, and slowly began to rise in the 70s. This is due to the Soviet Union aid helping Cuba as a planned economy. Although the economy in Cuba remained stagnant, it wasn't declining. That was until the collapse of the Soviet Union and the so-called special period that followed. This can be seen in a graph that covers the GDP per capita from 1989 to 2010, where the collapse of communism devastated Cuba, with Cuba's GDP dropping to half of what it was before the collapse. It would take 20 years for the GDP in Cuba to recover to what it was before the collapse. In the 90s, the average Cuban lost 9 kilograms due to food shortages, leaving some 40,000 people blind due to nutritional deficiencies. Cuba lost 70% of their buying power, a third of its economy, and half of the nation became unemployed. The illiteracy rate in 1950s Cuba ranged between sources. The UN Statistical Yearbook argues that up to 80% of the Cuban population was literate, while Cuba's government said the literacy rate was only 57%, while claiming 500,000 children were not attending school. The children in rural Cuba that went to school usually never finished first or second grade. Cuba during Batista's dictatorship in the hemisphere ranked 3rd in life expectancy, and in the world, it ranked 11th for the number of doctors per capita, with more doctors per capita than the US. Although most of these doctors were concentrated in Havana. By international standings, in the 1950s, Cuba's spending on health was high. It also had a high infant mortality rate similar to the countries like Germany, and it was the 3rd Latin American country with the best nutrition. And the United Nations Statistical Yearbook reports that in 1958, Cuba had the 3rd best medical system in Latin America. But not all was well, as many, especially the poor people, were seriously malnourished and hungry. Also, along the highway of the Sierra Maestra, Clusters of graveyards can be seen, which marks the spots where people died waiting for transportation to hospitals and clinics during the 1950s. Also, diseases were common all over Cuba. Following the revolution, lots of resources were poured into education. This can be seen in a graph which compares the average years of education in Cuba from 1950 to 2010, which shows the average years of education increasing once Castro took power. But with the communist government came some problems for the educational system, as the government monitored the students for any signs of political persuasion, and only those who supported the revolution were able to gain access to higher education. Schools often lacked libraries and laboratories, and many uni graduates often lacked employment options for their line of work, causing many engineers and doctors to work in tourism. Cuba elites invested heavily in healthcare, with the government giving basic healthcare to the poor and disadvantaged, with healthcare being made free. Castro aimed to put a doctor on every street in Cuba and become a world leader in medicine, which he succeeded in certain regards. In Castro's Cuba, nearly everyone was immunized, which helped stop the spread of diseases that plagued Cuba during the 1950s under Batista. The improvements in healthcare can be seen in a graph that compares the life expectancy between Eastern European countries and Cuba from 1950 to 2010. The graph shows the life expectancy in Cuba rising massively since the revolution, with it even surpassing the average life expectancy in Eastern Europe. But not all was well. The conditions in some hospitals and clinics were poor. The majority of Cuba's pharmaceuticals were exported, and Cuba doesn't import pharmaceuticals for its own people. So it caused shortages of pharmaceuticals and elementary medicines in Cuba's pharmacies. Lower-level medical staff received low pay, which caused many to decide to work in tourism instead, as they could make money through tips. In evaluating the living conditions of the Cuban people under Batista and Castro, it needs to be said that each regime presented a complex picture. Batista's Cuban era showed economic stability but massive amounts of corruption and inequalities between urban and rural workers. The country had a high literacy rate, and even though the government did spend a lot on healthcare, rural areas still suffered from diseases and massive difficulty to get to a hospital. Castro's Cuban era showed a stagnating economy until the economy crashed in the 90s. Healthcare and education were improved massively, with average years of education and life expectancy rising throughout the decades. This documentary has proven that Castro's communist rule, despite its economic struggles and political restrictions, massively improved the healthcare and education for the majority of Cubans. Thank you for watching.